You're standing in a cave. It's roughly 35,000 years ago, somewhere in what will eventually become southern France, and the only light you have is a small animal fat lamp flickering in your hand. The ceiling is low. The air smells like clay and old ash. And there, on the rock wall in front of you, someone has painted a horse. Not scratched it, not smeared it carelessly. Painted it. With shading, with movement, with attention to the way muscles pull under skin when the animal shifts its weight. This is Chauvet Cave, one of the oldest known sites of deliberate human art on Earth, and it raises a question that researchers have spent decades arguing about. A question that sounds simple until you actually try to answer it. Why? Why did someone crawl into the deep dark of a cave with a lamp and paint something beautiful where almost nobody would ever see it? Here's what makes this genuinely hard to explain. These weren't decorations. Most cave art is located deep inside cave systems, far from the entrances where people actually lived. Some panels in Lascaux require crawling through passages so tight that modern researchers have to exhale fully just to fit. The Font de Gomme cave in the Dordogne has paintings hidden in recesses so narrow that viewing them from any distance is essentially impossible. We're talking about images made in places that were difficult to reach, dimly lit at best, and not particularly useful as living space. If you wanted to make your home look nice, you wouldn't paint the back of the closet. And yet that's almost exactly what early humans were doing. Over and over again, across thousands of years and multiple continents, people kept going into the dark and making images. Something was pulling them in there. And I think understanding what it was tells you something genuinely strange about our species. Start with the sheer age of the thing because it helps to feel the weight of the timeline before anything else. The oldest confirmed cave art currently known is from a cave in Sulawesi, Indonesia, where red-painted hand stencils and animal figures have been dated to at least 45,500 years ago. That's not a rounding error. That's 45 millennia before this sentence was written. Chauvet in France is roughly 36,000 years old. Lascaux, which most people have heard of, is practically modern by comparison at around 17,000 years. So when people talk about cave painting as a phenomenon, they're describing a behavior that persisted across roughly 30,000 years of human prehistory. That's longer than the entire gap between ancient Egypt and the present day. Whatever was driving this, it wasn't a trend. It was something deep. Now, let's talk about the animals themselves, because that's the first thing that strikes you when you look at this art. The paintings are overwhelmingly of animals. As Chauvet alone, researchers have identified lions, mammoths, cave bears, woolly rhinoceroses, aurochs, horses, reindeer, bison, and ibex. At Lascaux, similar menagerie, similar commitment to making the animals look real, look alive, look like they're mid-stride. What's interesting, and researchers have been noting this for a long time now, is that the animals depicted don't closely match the animals that were actually being eaten. You'd expect subsistence hunters to paint the things they hunted most. But when archaeologists analyze the food remains at these sites, the ratio of painted animals to consumed animals doesn't line up cleanly. Cave lions, which were almost certainly not regular prey, appear constantly. Reindeer, which were likely a dietary staple, appear less often than their frequency in the food record would predict. So the art wasn't a shopping list. It wasn't just a record of the hunt. One of the most compelling frameworks researchers have developed to explain this is something called the Shamanic Hypothesis. The argument put forward most prominently by David Lewis Williams in the early 2000s is that the cave paintings are a record of altered states of consciousness. The deep cave environment itself was probably significant. Total darkness, sensory deprivation, the strange acoustics of underground spaces where sounds bounce in ways that can feel disorienting, all of these conditions are associated cross-culturally with trance states and visionary experience. Lewis Williams pointed out that the entoptic phenomena, which are the visual patterns the human nervous system generates internally during trance states, certain zigzags, grids, spirals, and tunnel forms, appear why? The remarkable regularity in prehistoric art across completely unconnected cultures. His argument was that the cave wasn't a gallery. It was a membrane, a boundary between the human world and whatever lay beyond it. And the paintings were attempts to reach through. Whether you accept the Shamanic hypothesis fully or partially, or not at all, it highlights something that the simpler explanations miss. Cave paintings weren't casual. The preparation required to make them was substantial. Some pigments involved grinding ochre and mixing it with animal fat, water, and sometimes plant material. Scaffolding evidence at Lascaux suggests the painters constructed wooden platforms to reach high sections of the cave walls, which means they carried wood in, built structures in the dark, painted, then presumably dismantled or left the structure. This was organized, planned, effortful work. And multiple researchers examining the handprints found in these caves, including the famous hand stencils where artists blew pigment around their own flattened hand against the wall, have concluded that women, children, and adolescents are all represented alongside adult men. This was not a specialized craft below, jinging to one kind of person. Different members of the community were present and participating. There's also the question of location within the caves, which doesn't get discussed enough outside academic circles. Researchers studying the acoustics of caves with paintings have found a statistically significant pattern. The animals painted in the deepest, most difficult to reach sections of these caves tend to be the ones that were considered most powerful. At several sites, the densest concentrations of dangerous animals, lions, bears, rhinoceroses, are in the chambers where the sound resonance is most extreme. Chambers where a drumbeat or a human voice produces a long, strange echo that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. Igor Reznikov, a researcher who spent years mapping the acoustic properties of painted caves in France, found that painted surfaces at Lascaux, and other sites correlated directly with spots where human sound reflected and amplified most dramatically. The artists were apparently choosing the spots that sounded the most otherworldly. That's not a coincidence you can explain away easily. Then there's the communication hypothesis, which takes a more pragmatic angle and is worth taking seriously precisely because it doesn't require any mysticism. Some researchers argue that cave paintings were simply early information storage, a record of animal behavior, migration routes, seasonal patterns, dangerous locations. The idea being that the cave was a kind of library, a place where accumulated knowledge about the natural world was encoded in images and passed on across generations. There's actually recent computational research supporting a version of this. Genevieve von Petzinger, a paleoanthropologist who spent years cataloging the geometric signs that appear alongside animal images in cave art worldwide, found that a set of roughly 32 recurring symbols appears across caves in Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Americas. The same symbols, same forms and cultures that had no known contact with each other. Her argument is that these weren't random marks. They were a proto-language, a shared symbolic vocabulary that predates writing by tens of thousands of years. If she's right, that changes the story significantly. The cave wasn't just a place to express something. It was a place to say something, to leave a message that someone else could read. Here's something else that keeps coming up in the research, though it's rarely the headline finding. A large number of cave paintings appear to deliberately exploit natural features of the rock surface. A bulging section of wall that looks vaguely like a buffalo's back. A natural crack that, with a few lines added, becomes the spine of a horse. A shallow depression in the ceiling that, by lamplight, creates the shadow of a moving figure when the flame flickers. The artists weren't just painting on flat surfaces. They were collaborating with the stone, finding the animal already half present in the rock, and completing it. That's not the behavior of someone making a practical record of local wildlife. That's something more like what we'd now call artistic intuition. The recognition that a shape in the material world could be transformed into something else with minimal intervention. The most honest answer to the why question is probably not one answer, but several, layered and overlapping in ways that mirror the paintings themselves, which are often layered too, different animals added over centuries by different hands in different styles. A UNESCO survey of Lascaux found at least 6 distinct stylistic periods represented in a single cave, meaning artists were returning to the same space across hundreds of generations and adding to what was already there. That implies the caves had persistent cultural meaning. The location mattered, not just the image. People came back because the place was already charged with whatever previous generations had left in it. What's clear, and what I think gets lost when this topic is reduced to ancient people making art, is that whoever made these paintings was operating with the full cognitive complexity of modern humans. The capacity for symbolic thought, for planning, for aesthetic judgment, for understanding that an image represents something beyond itself. A deer painted on a cave wall is not a deer. It stands in for a deer, or for something the deer meant, or for something the painter felt about deer, or for some relationship between the painter and the world that deer somehow embodied. That kind of representational thinking, the ability to let one thing stand for another, is the foundation of every symbolic system humans have ever built, including language, religion, mathematics, and everything that followed. And it was already fully operational 45,000 years ago in a cave in Indonesia, in a person who by every measure of cognitive biology was exactly like you. The painted handprints are the part that gets people most. You see them at site after site across the world, a hand pressed against cold stone, pigment blown around it, and now 30,000 years later, you're looking at the outline of a specific person's specific hand. Researchers at the Cave of El Castillo in Spain have found hand stencils dated to over 40,000 years ago. The hand that made that print has been gone for more than 400 centuries. And yet it's still there, still outlined on the rock, still unmistakably the impression of a human being who pressed their palm flat and said in whatever way they could manage at the time, something that amounts to, "I was here."